This is a recording of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. We are starting from Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph by the two dots at the bottom. So again, the Gemara, which we started yesterday, says, "Amamar Kaisis Ares." Somebody is chewing the rice. So the halacha is, and Rashi points out, Kamoshi, as it is. So Mavarch per Adama, you make on an Adama. Tachanoi, if you break it down, afoyu bishloi, right? You baked it and then you cooked it. So afapisha pruses kayamais, even if the pieces are still mekuyam in the sense that, as Rashi explained, shloni machav b'shulin, it didn't get destroyed. You could still see the pieces of the rice bread. So the halacha is v'tchila mevarach olav bar minim zaynas. Well, b'soif bracha achas mein shalish. So you make a mezainis and then an alamichya. That is to say, if you just had the rice, if your kaises just a piece of rice as is, so then you make a hadama. But if you are making it into a bread, and then even if you cooked it, the halacha is, while you still make a you still have to make a bracha before and after for this, but that bracha that you're making has changed. Now, instead of making Adama, now you've made it into Mezainis, and now instead of having a Bar Nefashis, now you're going to have a Alamichya. The Gemara asks, "Vatani l'b'soif klum," but you're saying to me now that once I take the rice and I grind it up and I make it into a bread, even if I cook it, I still make a Mezainis. So long as the prusos are kayomis, I still make a mezainis and an alamichya. But I have another brisa that says that you do not. The language is a b'soif v'leiklum. You don't make any bracha at all. It doesn't mean you don't make any bracha achrona. As Rashi explains, what we mean is essentially that you are going to be making a bar nefashis. V'leiklum here doesn't mean you don't make any bracha. Everything requires a bracha, but you're just making a bar nefashis. So you have a stira. On the one hand, it sounds like you have to make an al mechia. On the other hand, we have another brayse that says you have to make a bar nefashis. So the Gemara says, Rav Shesha says it's not a stira. Rav Shesha is like kasha. It's not a stira. Why not? Har Gamliel har Rabbanan. Rav Gamliel holds that you make al mechia, and the Rabbanan hold that you make a bar nefashis. The Tanya we have a brayse. Zaklal kol shu mishavas aminim Rav Gamliel ar mishalish brachos. You have a general principle that anything that comes from the seven minim, right? Chitos, Ereg, and of Rimain, Zayas, and Tamarim. Anything that comes from the Zayin minim, the halacha is, according to Rabbi Gamliel, you bench, and according to Chacham, you make again, the ala michya, you make ala eitz, whatever the specific is that you're eating. But you make a bracha achas mein shalosh, according to the Chachamim. And now the Gemara says over a story. Umaysa Gamliel v'hazaken shemisud mali b'yerichai. Gamliel and Zakanim were sitting in an attic in Yerichai. We have other places where there was an attic in Yerichai that comes up in Mersan Henry Aleph. Over there that they said somebody was very worthwhile. Somebody was a very special level, turned out to be Hillel. Other versions of it, Yerushalmi, maybe didn't take place in Aliyah and Yerichai in any event. In this story, Gamliel and Zakanim was sitting in Yerichai. Be'aviu lefneim kaisvais v'achol. And they brought in front of them dates to eat. V'nashem Gamliel rishus to Rabbi Kiva levarach. And Gamliel gave rishus to Rabbi Kiva to make the bracha, talking about the bracha achrona. And presumably, Rabbi Gamliel expected that Rabbi Kiva would say like he holds, which is you have to make you have to bench. Why would he have expected Rabbi Kiva held that? Not 100% clear. but nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva didn't do what was expected. But it points out, Sover Hayeshe Yerachim Brachos K'moshe Hayasav. He thought he would do what Rabbi Gamliel felt. Nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva didn't do that. Kavatz Baruch Rabbi Akiva Baruch Achas Min Shalosh. He instead made an he made an ala eitz. So Amalei Rabbi Gamliel Akiva Amas Yata Machas Rosh Chavina Machlekes. He said, "Why are you putting yourself between this dispute that I'm having, with the rabbis? This idea of Rabbi Akiva Amas Yata Machnas Rosh is something that we see in other places as well. The Gemara tells us in Chagiga Yudalid that Rabbi Yitzchak Lili said to Rabbi Akiva Amas Yata Isa Shchina Chol." Later on in Daf Mem, we're going to have that Rabbi Akiva is going to say, Rabbi Yechon Menuri ad Masayat Mechalim Iman Yisrael, and Rabbi Yechon Menuri is going to respond to Masayat Meichel Yisrael Nevelis. So it's not something that's this entirely uncommon phrase as it relates to Rabbi Akiva. We find there was other Tanaim as well, but here it relates to Rabbi Akiva. Anyhow, so Rabbi Gamliel is not happy that Rabbi Akiva didn't make Berachas Hamazon. Instead, he made a bracha mein shalish. So he said to him, "Why are you doing this? Why are you putting yourself in this machlekes?" So Amalei Rabbeinu, af b'shato emer kain, v'chaveracha emer kain. Even though you say you make a bracha samazon, your colleagues, the other rabbis, they say no. They say you make a bracha mein shalish. So Maratenu Rabbeinu, you taught us Yachav Ramalach and Karab. So I have to go like the rabbin. That's why I made the bracha the way I did. Rehuda says further in the name of Rabbi Gamliel, Kosher Meshivas Aminin, everything that's from the Zayamin, Vlemin Dagon, but not one of the grains. In other words, not a Chita Saira, but the other five. I'm min Dagon Vleaso Pas. Or what we're dealing with is a situation that it is, let's say Chita Saira, but it wasn't made into a bread. So what is the halach? What do you make on it? Rabbi Gamliel says that you make on it a full benching through shalosh brachas. So that is to say, on the what is from the Shivas Haminim, even if it's not dogon, you make a full benching, as we know that's the sheet of Rabbi Gamliel. And in relation to something that's from the grain family, but it is not made into a bread, according to Rabbi Gamliel, you still bench. However, Chacham disagree. Chacham are in bracha achas. The Chacham say no, you just make a bracha mein shalosh, right? Whether it's from the Shivas Haminim, not dogon, you make a bracha mein shalosh, you don't bench. And in the situation of the dogon that you don't make into a bread, you also make a bracha mein shalosh. And then the Brisa continues and says, "Kol she'enu lo mishivas haminim v'lo min dagon," something that's not from the shivas haminim and it is not dagon. So in other words, it's not a type of grain, and it's not from the shivas haminim. So what then is it? Going past eres v'deichel. Let's say you have rice bread or millet bread. So Rabbi Gamliel says over there, bracha achas mein shalish, achamam v'lo klum. Rabbi Gamliel says you make a bracha achas mein shalish. In other words, you make it al mechia. And according to the Chachamim, you don't make any bracha. In other words, you make it just the bar nefashos. So Mayu Kimta, so what's this going to come out? Rabbi Gamliel. So this is the proof that this is the sheet of Rabbi Gamliel. That is to say that before we said that the steer in the brises, when somebody has bread that they made into rice, they cooked it, etc. The example of the rice was even if the when somebody cooked it, afisha pruses kayamis, even if the pieces are still nicker that they're bread, you don't make them as zainis, and then you make it al mechia, according to one brisa, and the other brisa said you make nothing, you just make it a bar nefashos. So we're saying now the one that says that you're making a al mechia, that's what we're gonna leave. That's exactly what we said over here. That on pas eretz v'deichen, Rabbi says you make a bracha asmein shalish, and the Chacham say just make a bar nefashos. So we're good, or so we thought. Says the Gemara, "Mayu Kimta, Rabbi Gamliel, you want to make this out that this is like Rabbi Gamliel. We're now on Lamed Zayin on the base." So I must say for the Reisha, there's another part of the Brisa that we didn't yet quote, and that's the Sefer of the Reisha. The Reisha told us about the Prusa Sarkayama, you make a Mazanis and then you make an Alamechia in the Brisa. But then we look at what that Brisa as it continues, and it says in Mena Prusa Kayama is if the pieces are not there, so then the halacha is Yitchil Mevarach Alabar Minei Mazanis, and B'Sev Mevarach Alabar Chachas Min Shalosh. And the halacha is going to be that again, you make a mezainis and you make a bracha and shalosh, you make an alamichya after you eat. Says the Gemara, Mani, who's this? Who's this man Damar who's telling us that even if the process are not kayamis, even if there's no aspect of this rice bread has now been fully cooked, and now there's no discernible bread here anymore. Who's telling us that on this you're going to make a alamichya? You're going to say Shabbat Gamliel? I don't understand. Says the Gemara. B'ma'ah kim to Gemara. Im sefer deresh im eina prusas kayamis b'chila. Im eina prusas kayamis b'chila m'varach labar m'nei mezanis. L'b'sefer m'varach labar cha'achas mein shalish. Mani ir b'gamliel hashta ka'isves fad daisa omer gamliel gimel bracha is im eina prusas kayamis min paya. Says the Gemara, I don't understand. What is this chiddush? You tell me that if the prusas are not kayamis, that you make a mezanis and al mechia. What's the chiddush there for Rabbi Gamliel? Rabbi Gamliel is the one who told us that you make a full benching even on things that are seemingly, we would say that they're not necessarily warranting a benching. Nevertheless, Rabbi Gamliel still holds that you make a full berachas hamazon, as Rashi says, "Hashta filo adai Rabbi Gamliel b'mishnah batzraisa oimin dagon v'lo yasoy pas v'berach achar gimel brachas." Rabbi Gamliel says that on the daisa, you're making a full benching on filo daisa Rabbi Gamliel b'masnisa batzraisa oimin dagon v'lo yasoy pas v'berach achar gimel brachas. So according to Rabbi Gamliel, you're making a bracha even on a situation. You're making a full berachas hamazon on a date. You're making a full berachas hamazon on some type of a grain that wasn't made into bread. If you are required to make a berachas hamazon on something that was never even made into bread, you're going to have a question on something that was made into bread, and then it was cooked, and it lost its stature, as you can't tell that it's bread anymore. So you have a question that on what the halacha is going to be, that you have to make a bracha achas mein shalish. If he holds it even on things that never made it into bread, you have to make a berachas hamazon. So on a situation which maybe that's not mean a dagan, but you made it into a rice bread. So he says you have a mazonis. You have a question that he's going to say that you make a alamichya even if it's not prusas kayamais. He says that's the Gemara's proof that it can't be Rabbi Gamliel. Says the Gemara el pshita rabbanan. It has to then be for sure it's the rabbanan, not Rabbi Gamliel. So ihachi kasher the rabbanan, not the rabbanan. If these two branches are both the rabbanan, how could one say you make an alamichya and one say you make a bar nefashis? So on that, the Gemara answers, what do you have to say? You have to say, you have to sort of amend, you have to change the girsa. On that first bracha that says, bracha achas mein shalish, you have to say the same thing. The is enim v'arach lav leklum. You don't make any sort of al-michi on it. Instead, you make, as we say, bar nefashis. That concludes this Gemara, and so we end up that it's not a proof that it has to go through Rabbi Gamliel, and in fact, it could be going through the Rabbanan, and they don't say that you make a al-michi after rice bread. You make or millet bread. What you make is a bar nefashis. Now, at this stage, the Gemara, for the next number of pages, goes through a lot of different examples of different types of foods and discusses what kind of bracha to make. So the Gemara now says that the two dots, Amar Rava, Hai Riyato Dechakloi. What's Riyato Dechakloi? Rashi says, I should point out that there is a Rashi right before Riyato. It says V'hilchasa Loi Garsinon. Rashi says again, we're not being garis V'hilchasa. So now we've had that now a couple of times. You'll see that Rashi says that on Lamed Ches Lamed Aleph, V'hilchasa Loi Garsinon Me'alachis Gedoyleisu. Rashi said that also on Lamed Zayin Lamed Aleph, Rashi says Av Rabbanan Loy Vatani V'legasin V'hilchas V'milchas Halachas Gedoyleisu, and over here Rashi also says V'hilchas Loi Garsinon. So in a few places here, Rashi is saying that we're not garrison. All right. So what is this Rihata Dechakloi? So if you look at the Ben Chananel, Ben Chananel says it's a Maichel Sha'osim Biktera. It's a type of food that you make in the pot, and it's made out of oil, flour, and honey. So it sounds like what we've already had before. Right, when we talked about the chavetz kedera, was a min ma'achol kafui k'may cholav shechavtzu b'kev v'kachais ma'achol kafui b'kedera. Right, it was put into the pot. Kam farshla kimcha the dovsha mishcha. It has flour, honey, and oil. So this rihata the chakloi sounds similar to the chavetz kedera. And we learn out that they used to make it in different ways. Says the Gemara, when it has, Rav is saying, when it has a lot of flour, you make a mezainis, my time this mean the ikar. Just like we saw on Lamed Vav and Beis, when the flour is the ikar, you make a mezainis. However, the mechayza, the mafshibei kimcha in mechayza, where there was more honey, there wasn't so much flour. Shahako. There they made shahako. Rashi tells us Mechayz is b'nei Krachel, city. Rashi doesn't explain anything more, but if you look at Ben Chananel says Mechayz is shehein ashirim, where they were rich, they could afford honey, so they put in more honey, and rather than putting in more more flour. Flour was cheaper than honey. So the city people were richer, so they could afford to put in more honey. This idea that the people in Choza are rich is actually seen in a couple of places. If you look, the Gemara on the end of Bava Kama, the Gemara says in Kuf Yotes and Bava Kama that normally we say when a person is coming to the collector, comes to a house, only a woman's there. So you could take a davar muad, you could take something small, but something major, she has to get permission from her husband. But a mechayza, the woman would give stuff that would be considered major, and the tzedakah collector was allowed to take it because from mechayza, what is major for them is the davar muat. Rashi says, why? Because they're heim ashirim, they're very rich. We also have another Gemara about this in Pesachim Nunam Beis. The Gemara tells us that actually Rava is complaining about the woman of mechayza. It's not that just they don't work on Erev Shabbos, but they don't work any day because they're very pampered. So in Mechayza, they made this Rihata the Chakloi, or the Chavetz Keder. They made it in a bit of a different way. They made it with the honey being the acre, and therefore the bracha is a Shahakol. So Moshe said, "The Mechayza Lema Avshe came from the bracha of Shahakol Ne'Bedvarei. My time of Dov Sheikar." Well, Damarava, then Rava, as it were, backtracked and changed his mind and said, in both situations, whether or not the flour is more than the honey or the honey is more than the flour, you always make a mzenis. Why? Because of the statement of Rav and Shmuel that you always make a mzenis if there is something in it from the five grains. This idea that Rav and Shmuel is quoted again, even though we on the page before, if you remember, on Lamed Vav, on Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, we shlog up Tiyufta, the Rav Shmuel Tiyufta, as I pointed out, that the Rishonim noticed that while we are shlogging up Rav and Shmuel, we're not shlogging them up entirely. We're only shlogging them up in relation to an aspect of what they said. However, by Tarevis of Chamesh Aminim, and anything that's going to be mixed with one of the five grains, their words were not absplug. This is what the Rebbeinu Chananel said. Therefore, it remains like them, and you make them a Zionist and a Al Hamichyo. Fine. A new case that we have about, again, something similar. So, Amar Rabbi Yosef says that Hai Chavitza de Isbe Perurin, right? The Chavitza, not 100% clear exactly what that is, but again, if you look at Ben Chananel, Ben Chananel says Chavitza de Isbe Perurin is Chatichosh Shenoisten B'Marak. You take pieces of bread and you're putting them into the soup. Well, we again discuss later on Lamites um, situations where people put in bread into the soup. Fine. So we'll see more about that later. But for our purposes now, chavitza de isbe peruin, if somebody's taking bread and putting it into the soup, and what they're doing is really taking pieces. So hi chavitza de isbe peruin kizayas, if this chavitza, this soup is going to have the size of these pieces of bread are going to be a kazayas, so then it's chilim avarkalav hamaitzi lachem anar, so it's avarkalav shalosh brachas. Then initially you should wash on the bread, and you should bench the less bepurin kazayas. If these pieces of bread are being put in are not a kazayas, so then it's chilim avarkalav barminim azanas l'busayv bracha achas mein shalosh. So then you should make a mezainis, and afterwards you should make an al. Rav Yosef, Minalo, how do I know this? How do I know that on depending on the size of the bread pieces, you could make either a hamaitzi or a mezainis? The Tanya, because I have a brisa that teaches like I'm in a market of menachas b'Yushalayim. Somebody was let's say we're talking about a claim. He was bringing kar mincha, and he hasn't done it either for a long time. Maybe he hasn't done it at all. Whatever the case may be, Rashi Menachas tells us that was about a kayan who has never brought a kar mincha, or maybe it's a new mincha that hasn't been brought before like minchas ha'omer. In any event, the situation is such. I should point out Rashi over here that says that if the kayan hasn't brought it, zeh yomim rabim, right? He hasn't brought it many days. Again, Rashi Menachas sounds like he had never brought it, or maybe it was a new mincha for the year. In those situations, halach is you make a shechianu. So the Tanya haya oimedu makav menachas b'Yushalayim oimer baruch shechianu v'kimanu yinu lazman hazeh. So the kohen who's bringing the mincha, he has to make a shechianu. Natlan la'achlan. So now, if he wants to eat this korban mincha, so then varach hametzi lachem haaretz. Then he has to make hamaitzi. Utani Allah, we learn further over there, Vekulan, Paisis, and Kazayas. And all these are small pieces. Right? Because the pasuk tells us, Paisis also pitim, you have to make it small. So, what do you see from here? That the halacha is that since the pieces have been made into kizaysim, and you see that the kohen, if he wants to eat it, has to make a hamaitzi. So you see a proof that when you have bread pieces of a certain size, the halacha is you make a hamaitzi. So Amalei Abaya, so Abaya then responds to Rabbi Yosef. His rabbi says, "Elamayata l'tana de Rabbi Shmuel." So how does this work then according to the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel? Dama perchin asher machzirin l'sultan. According to the Tana of Rabbi Shmuel, what he holds is that on these menachos that are baked, before they are before they have done a kemitza with them, you have to first break them up so much so that they're basically going back to their initial constitution. They're going back to their being flour. It's like you're making um, you're making like matzah meal, right? You're making it into sort of like bread meal. You're taking the bread, breaking it up so much that it's become effectively soyless again. So what are you going to say? "Achanamid lai bari bruchei hamatzi lechem min haaretz?" Right? What are you going to say in this situation? What is he going to require? What kind of a bracha? Right? Are you going to say that he also going to require hamatzi? Mechitem hachanamid. If you want to say, yeah, well, maybe in fact he does argue, right? So again, v'tanya lavikulam poising kzayis. Amalei bay al miat al tanas v'rishmal darim perchnat shemasin l'salt and hachanam dai by bruche. Amalei tzedach maratz v'chitem hachanami. V'tanya leket mikulam kzayis v'achlon im chametz hu anish karetz im matzu adam yotzei b'yedech b'pesach. So this kind who now wants to eat this mincha. So if he basically was malakit a lot of pieces and has it now a kazayas and it's Pesach and he ate it and it's chametz, so then he gets kares. And if it's matzah, then he's going to be his chiyuv of eating matzah on Pesach. So what do you see? That even if it's significantly smaller than a kazayas, then it's nevertheless still gets hametz, it's still considered bread. So where are you coming from to say that the only time you have to make hamaitzi is if the piece of bread is bigger than a kazayas? Here you see that it's tiny pieces and you still make hamaitzi. So the Gemara says no. Hachamayaskinim b'sha'ar. So we're talking about a situation where the kain took these small pieces and essentially baked it back together. Took these tiny pieces of what once was bread and now has been crushed into very fine type of flour, and he essentially put it back together and baked it, and now he has again like bread. So it says the verse is really Iyachi and Maseifa v'hu she'achlam b'chdei achilas pras. Then why is it that this Brachot tells us that this kain has to eat it b'chdei achilas pras? He has to eat it in a certain period of time. It sounds like he's eating the pieces within a certain period of time, so he has to make a maitzi. But v'b'sha'arsan, if you put it all together, hay she'achlan she'achlu mibaya. Why are you saying she'achlan? Why are you saying that he ate them? It sounds like he ate a lot of different pieces. It's not true, right? Here, what did he do? He's eating only one piece because he's changed the whole thing back into one piece of bread. So that would seem to militate against the idea of saying that he was putting it back together. And rather, he ate it in small pieces, smaller than a kizayis, and nevertheless, you still have to make a hamaitzi. So, after the Gemara, we're talking about a situation where it's coming from a bigger, right, a big loaf. Um, Rashi explains that what we mean is we're not talking about it was arson. We're not talking about a situation where he sort of put it together and baked it again. But nevertheless, what we're saying is that it's chashiv, the chashiv have lechem b'vam lechem gadol. Since it came from a bigger bread, v'nisham min lechem shlei nifres kulai, and since the remainder of the bread, the remainder of the loaf is still there, and that is still in its full state. So that's why you're able to make the bracha of hamaitzi on it, even though these pieces are quite small and maybe smaller than a kazayas. But if maybe the whole bread was totally broken apart, so then then you wouldn't make a bracha necessarily on these small pieces that are less than a kazayas. And you wouldn't be yotzer, and you wouldn't necessarily and you wouldn't be making a hamaitzi on it. So we end up in a situation where the Gemara's answer is that it's not necessarily a proof that the only time you make a hamaitzi is when the pieces are bigger than a ksayas. So therefore, the Gemara explains my have law. So what then was sort of decided in this kind of a situation? So Amar Sheish is like chavitza Afal gav the let's pay purim kizayis and baruch alav hamitz lachem and arts. This chavitza, as we already explained, this chavitza is a situation where one is essentially taking the it's taking the um, bread pieces, putting it into the soup. So the Rav Sheshes is making a conclusion that even if it doesn't have kazayas pieces, even if they're smaller than a kazayas, it nevertheless still warrants to get a hamaitzi. Amarava v'hu de'ika aleh reisa denama. But it should still have a toya, Rashi says, maris halechem. It should still have some sort of, it should still look like bread to some degree. So that's the halacha. Halacha l'maisa, we do say that you make a hamaitzi, even though there are going to be pieces that are less than a kesayas, but it has to still look like bread. Whether or not that's possible after something is cooked, that's the subject of debate among the Rishonim. Some say by definition, when something is cooked, it cannot, in fact, have any definition of bread anymore. It does not look like bread after it's cooked. And others say, no, no, it could still have that. Okay, we'll continue the Gemara now. Gemara again has a few other examples that the Gemara wants to understand. Says the Gemara, no, sorry, we just true kinan. True kinan. Chayav mechala. You might be asking what is true kinan, the Gemara is going to ask also. So true kinan chayav mechala. B'chiyasa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yechanan, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he said over the name of Rabbi Yechanan. Remember, he's one of the four major people, right, who traveled from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. So B'chiyasa Ravin Amar Rabbi Yechanan true kinan B'turim min achala. So he quoted Rabbi Yechanan saying that true kinan are pater and chala. I should point out that the Gra here changes this girsa. The Gra says that you have to say chayavim. So again, so the first halacha was true kinan or chayav mechal. Then Ravin comes from Eretz Yisrael and quotes over the name of Rabbi Yechanan, true kinan are chayavin chala. So that would be an agreement. Now the Morris wants to know, my true kinan, what is this true kinan? Rabbi koiva de'ara. Not really sure that helps us so much, but basically, as Rashi explains, you make a hole in the oven somewhere. And then you put in there water and some dough, and it sort of cooks in this hole in the oven and becomes some sort of a bread. So the Gemara is telling us that true kinan is chayiv and chala. And Rabbi Yochanan agrees with this according to Ravin. Another example. Teresa Petur Menachal. Now you might be asking, what is Teresa? Not Mother Teresa, just plain Teresa. So Mar says, my Teresa, what is it? Yikadami Gvil Mertach. Now those that say that it's this Gvil Mertach, what does that mean? It's nice than Kemach Umayim, says Rashi, put in flour and water, Bekli. And then you're like, sort of mixing it up. And then you sort of take this batter and just pour it on the top of the oven. Like maybe it's called a griddle. And then it cooks like that. So it doesn't really get the shape of a normal bread, but it is nevertheless the same ingredients, maybe even the same type of a consistency, but it's not cooked in the same manner. So teresa can either be gevil mertach, v'yigdar minahama dehindika. Others say no, it's the bread of the hindika. So maybe it's Indian bread. Not 100% clear. Rashi tells us what is nahama dehindika. It's batek. You're taking your dough, sha'if and b'shfud, and you're putting it on a spit. And you're constantly mixing it in oil or in eggs and oil. So this, and that's, I guess, you're baking it in the fire. So Abai says that Teresa was Ptur and Chal. And the Gemara didn't know what Teresa was. Either it was Gvil Mertach, or the other option was Nahama de Hindika. So this Nahama de Hindika would also be Pater and Chala. Or, as we said, change the gears, so it's Chai and Chala. Apologies. So, when we said it was Chai and Chala, I was talking about the true Kenan. Um, and then we said over there to Teresa's Pater and Chala. Um, and we weren't sure what it is. Either it's a Gvil Mertach or Nahama de Hindika. In both of these situations, right, what we're saying is it's not chayev in chal. These are pater. The Ika de Amri, and we have a third opinion what might this Teresa might be. So what's the third opinion? The Ika de Amri lechem asur lekutach. Kutach was some sort of wonderful mixture, which they didn't actually bake in the oven, says Rashi. Ela b'chama, they would put it out in the sun. But basically, kutach is some sort of gross. I shouldn't say it was gross, but it was a bit of an odd delicacy they had. It was like spoiled milk and spoiled bread, and so everything is spoiled. And they put it together, and it becomes delicious. I don't really know how that worked, but in any event, so according to the way the Gemara's opinion is about what Teresa is, it's either again. It's either the Gvil Mertach, or the Nahamad de Hindika, or Lechem Asa the Kutach. And all those situations it's going to be potter from from taking off Chal. Says the Gemara, Tani Rabbi Chia, Lechem Asa the Kutach, potter and Chala. Bread that you make for Kutach is potter and Chala. About Tani Chai B'Chala, I have another verse that says Chai B'Chala. Says the Gemara, Hasam Kedik Tani Taima, Rabbi Huda Ma'asem Mechichan Leo, Ason Ke'aven Chayavin. Kelimudim Ptur. So Rabbi Yehuda wants to answer that it depends. Hasam Ke'tan time. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ma'aseh Mechichala. What you're doing to this bread that you were serving with the kutach, that's going to determine what your intentions were. If you made them ke'aven, if you made them like big loaves, so that looks like a skloya, says Rashi, and we are now on the top of Lam Chesam and Aleph. So then Goli Daite de Lalachamaso, then you're Megaladas, that you mean it's for bread, and so therefore you would be in a situation where you would be Chayiv Mechala. But if you're in a situation where you made them kilimudin, if you made them, Rashi says kinisarim, like you made them like a bunch of boards, in other words, you're not trying to make this into bread at all. So then in that situation, you'll be pater and challah. So it depends on your intention and what we can discern or glean from your intention. So now by says Rav Yosef, Hi Kuva Da'ara. This Kuva Da'ara that we already spoke about before. We want to know what is Trukinin. And Abai said it was Kuva Da'ara. It was like the thing that you take the batter and pour it into a hole in the stove and it would just cook there. So Abai now asked Rabbi Yosef, "Hi kuva da'ara my we talked whether or not the kuva da'ara would be chayim and chala. We said it was chayim and chala. You want to know what bracha you make on it? So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yosef responds to Abai, "Umalei misavis na'amu." So Rabbi Yosef says to him, "Do you think that this is bread? They should be making normative brachas that one would associate with bread on it. Guvla ba'almahu. It's not really bread. It's just, essentially um, this kind of mixture that was put together, but it is not bread at all." Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yosef says you don't make a hamaitzi on it. Amalemi saras nahama who guvla ba'almahu v'archan li bar minei mezainis. You just make a mezainis on it, nothing more. So on this, the Gemara says something very fascinating. It says the Gemara, Mar Zutra covers Hidush Aliyah. Mar Zutra took this kuva da'ara, and he was kaveh asud on it. That's what he ate for his meal. Ubarach li ha'maitzi lachem ha'aretz. He made ha'maitzi, u'shalosh brachas, and he made a full benching. Or Amar Baravashi, Pesach. Person, even if they would eat this on Pesach, would be Yetzi's mitzvah of matzah by time lechem aini creamery, because this is still called lechem aini. Still called enough of a bread that it will be Yetzi for matzah, and enough of a bread that you can be kaveh suda on it, and you can make amitzi on it. That is how we paskin. We will stop over here because what we ended up doing is starting from the next line in the next class on Lam Ches Have a wonderful day.